In 2018, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan rose to power through the Velvet Revolution, promising peace. Since then, Armenia has faced defeat in a war, lost Nagorno-Karabakh, and finds itself in a visibly weaker position in ongoing peace talks with Azerbaijan. Nevertheless, Pashinyan won elections after the lost war, and no protest in the past 6 years has significantly threatened his position. The question is, what keeps him in power, and will there be a turning point? The history and politics of independent Armenia have been shaped by its conflict with neighbouring Azerbaijan. The dispute has always centred around a region known as Nagorno-Karabakh, over which the two nations fought two devastating wars, the first between 1988 and 1994, and the second more recently, in 2020. Despite years of peace negotiations, a lasting resolution has remained elusive, largely due to disagreements over the region's status. The Velvet Revolution in Armenia in 2018 and the shift in the balance of power after the 2020 war dramatically altered the dynamics of the conflict. In response, the Armenian government redirected its focus from the region's status to ensuring the safety and security of Armenians living there. Nevertheless, in September 2023, Azerbaijan launched a new offensive which resulted in the dissolution of local institutions and armed forces, and triggered a mass exodus of the Armenian population.
Within 1 week, our people, over 120,000 people, fled our ancient homeland. And only over 40 people left there, and the majority of them in the subsequent weeks and months also left.
This 3 million strong country suddenly had to accommodate the equivalent of 4% of its population, creating a significant burden for a state where nearly 1/3 of its people live below the poverty line.
In the very first days of receiving Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, we have seen very huge societal effort, but also very strong mobilization of state institutions.
While the initial aid was extensive, the integration process has been more challenging. The government is often criticised for the lack of a long-term plan. The most pressing issue appears to be permanent housing. In May of this year, the government approved a programme that provides one-time financial assistance to Karabakh Armenians for the purchase or construction of homes. The amount of aid varies by location, as the government seeks to distribute the population across the entire territory, including the borders with Azerbaijan. However, this approach has faced significant criticism from Karabakh Armenians, 40% of whom have settled in Yerevan and its surroundings.
A lot of people came to Yerevan, understandably, because they are concerned about further border attacks, incursions, and, having lived through at least 2 wars, they don't want to experience that sense of danger.
Yerevan also offers more job opportunities. Unemployment is another issue that Karabakh Armenians face. According to a report by the UNHCR, only around 23% of refugees had a stable income as of April this year. Azat Adamian has found work. He opened a bar in Yerevan named Bardak after his previous bar in Karabakh, which he had to leave behind in September 2023.
У меня еще был проект, чтобы взять одно большое село заброшенное, взять своих друзей, которых я знаю, которые работают, переехать, переселиться в это село и сделать самое красивое село в Армении. Но потом, знаете, получилось так, что я отдачу не почувствовал. То есть я это хочу только я. Но это я один решить уже не мог, потому что это крупный вопрос, и надо было все это сделать очень быстро. И вот так, решил, что надо открыть паб, нашли территорию и открылись.
Azat considered not staying in Armenia and moving on. One of the reasons he ultimately decided to stay was the warm welcome and support from civil society. They provided not only material support, but also help in finding employment. For example, in the city of Yerevan, Hasmik Margarian offers requalification and jobs to women from Nagorno-Karabakh in her workshop focused on Armenian embroidery.
Հիմա մեր կանանց մենք աշխատում ենք եւ Արցախից տեղահանված կանանց հետ եւ մեր մայրիկների հետ դասընթացներ ունենք կարի դասընթաց կարպետագործության, ասեղնագործության ու տարբեր տենց դասընթացներ իրականում սա նաեւ աշխատանք է դարձել.
One of Hasmik's students is pianist Ida, who arrived in Yerevan in September 2023.
Мы поехали в Степанакерт. Уже между Мартунией и Степанакертом были азербайджанцы. Невозможно было своим ходом поехать, поэтому, чтобы благополучно доехать, нас должны были на автобусах вывезти. Мы выехали, по дороге зашли азербайджанцы, посмотрели, проверили, нет оружия, нету, и вышли. И мы поехали в Степанакерт, в школе, на полу, там, на одеждах. Мы спали несколько дней, 2 дня. 27-го выехали и 29-го оттуда выехали с Степанакерта в Ереван. Мы уставшие, изнуренные, измученные, переживали очень много. Честно говоря, нам сказали, что вообще закроют, 20 тысяч хотят оставить. Мы в этом плане тоже переживали, потому что половина моей семьи приехала, половина осталась. Я думала, их не увижу.
Although Ida hopes to return one day, it is currently not possible. In addition, after the September offensive, the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh has completely disappeared from the agenda of peace talks, and the government considers this chapter closed.
We do not treat the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh as a political argument with our conversation in Azerbaijan. We treat it as a humanitarian situation.
This approach is met with strong opposition from former residents of Nagorno-Karabakh. They argue that a peace deal cannot be reached without including the region, as such an agreement would not ensure lasting peace in the long term.
This agreement should be inclusive agreement, should include all the topics, should address all the problems of our states and people, and should find solutions for all of those problems based on the international norms, and should take into account the voices of all the targeted or impacted communities, including our people.
The opposition echoes this sentiment, with part of it led by former Armenian presidents Robert Kocharyan and Serge Sargsyan, both hailing from Nagorno-Karabakh. As they are highly unpopular in Armenia, they see the Karabakh community as an opportunity to expand their electoral potential.
I would say the opposition is trying to kind of co-opt them, and the government is not doing a very good job of talking to them and making sure that they are on its side. But I would say that the majority of them probably may remain neutral because for them there are other issues now. They are, they really have to establish their lives here. They have to basically start from scratch, and they are not very active politically.
The issue of Nagorno-Karabakh is not the only topic facing criticism. The most explosive recent event has been the delimitation of the border in the Tavush region. In April, the government approved the demarcation of the border with Azerbaijan and Tavush according to the Alma-Ata Declaration of 1991, ceding control of 4 abandoned villages that it had occupied since the war in the 1990s. This decision sparked protests among the residents of Armenian villages, for whom the new border brought changes. The protests started in the village of Karants, where residents were concerned about Azerbaijan's border guards moving closer to their settlements, making them more vulnerable to potential attacks. They were also worried that some parts of the village would be taken by Azerbaijan. The delimitation also affected a road connecting Armenia with neighbouring Georgia.
There was a part of the road that would leave the sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia, enter the sovereign territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan, and then come back to continue onwards. And this issue is being addressed as well. We see new infrastructure being built that will allow for citizens to commute between communities, between the Armenian villages, but also as part of the interstate communication of the Republic of Armenia.
The delimitation also affected several private properties. The government promised compensation to all those affected and claims that the issues related to the demarcation are manageable and justified by the ultimate goal of the process, which is to improve the security situation in the area.
It also adds to the security of the communities on both sides because together with the delimitation and demarcations, Armenia and Azerbaijan agree that it's no longer state armies, militaries supervising these areas, that they withdraw, and it is border guards, which are armed much lighter, not so heavy, that monitor their own state border in Armenia from the Armenian side and from the Azerbaijani side, their border security.
Իսկ ընդհանրապես մեր գյուղը շուտ բարգավաճում է, եթե կարող եմ ասել, փառմերը շուրվա ղեկավարին, որը սահմանապար գյուղերին իր մեծ աջակցությունն է ցուցաբերում տնաշինության, ուրեմն արտերկիր տեղափոխված մեր երիտասարդներին վերադառնալու սեփական բնորան, սեփական ծննդավայր։ Փառք Աստծո 30 տարի տառապել ենք, այսօր ունենք այս ասֆալտ ճանապարհ, որ այսօր դուք չեք տեսել, դեռ չեք պատկերացնում ինչ է։
The protests in the area served as a catalyst for the emergence of a new movement, Tavush for the Homeland. Led by Bagrat Galstanian, a representative of the Tavush Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church, this movement brought the protests from Tavush to Yerevan, drawing crowds of up to 20,000 people.
That so-called delimitation and demarcation hasn't been done according to the constitution and laws of our country, as well as there are no international principles that have been kept or followed. And also, there are no international guarantors or mediators between the two sides. No certain, let's say, program how it should be done, the delimitation and demarcation process. They have been talking about peace agreement, peace pact, which is a total concession from our side. There are no real and just peace talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Նույնն էլ շատ հաճախ մեր այս ամբողջ շարժման մեջ այն զգացողությունն է երբեմն, որ մենք շատ հաճախ չենք առնչվում կամ չենք տեսնում, բայց մեր ժողովրդի կյանքը
տեսեք, ուրեմն 2018-ից մեր պետությունը ունեցավ մի չարիք, որի անունը Nikol Pashinyan է, եւ իր կառավարման տարիների ընթացքում մենք կորցրեցինք շատ բաներ, մեր զինվոր տղեկին, մեր եղբայրներին, Արցախը կորցրեցինք շատ տարածքներ, հիմա ժամանակն է եկել, որպեսզի ոտքի կանգնելու, որովհետև հայը միշտ հաղթած է, դուս եկել ցանկացած կռվում, ցանկացած պայքարում, հայը միայն պարտվել է դավաճանության արդյունքում,
Իսկ հիմա ժամանակը եկել է, որ դավաճանին ուղարկենք այնտեղ, որտեղից եկել է եւ մեր հզոր պետությունը նորից ոտքի կանգնեցնենք.
After the large protests in May and June, attendance at the Tavush for the Homeland events has now dwindled to just a few hundred people. Political analysts note that the movement lost momentum over the summer. However, the Archbishop asserts that the initiative is currently undergoing a phase of reorganisation, with plans for another significant step ahead.
We are in the process of reorganizing, remobilizing our people, specifically having very intense and very important conversation and planning, let's say, with different groups, with professionals, with different layers of society.
The success of the movement is constrained by several factors. For instance, Pashinyan is unable to legally hold the position of Prime Minister because of his dual citizenship. Furthermore, the organisation has the open support of Robert Kocharian and Serge Sargsyan.
They understood that they shouldn't be in the spotlight. So that's why they're supporting this archbishop, who's a priest, who obviously doesn't have a history of being in the government before the revolution. So he's a more neutral figure in this sense. But still, this connection is very obvious. He hasn't been able to kind of distance himself from the old government, which means that there's a limit to their popularity.
Despite the opposition's efforts to mobilise Karabakh Armenians and those dissatisfied with the government's approach to delimitation, political analysts suggest that Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's position remains relatively stable for the time being.
First of all, as usual in post-Soviet space, politics is divided between current authorities and former authorities. People still say, okay, Pashinyan goes and second or third president, or people affiliated with second or third president of Armenia, who ruled Armenia until 2018, they will come back. People don't want them. Plus, many don't believe in politics at all due to the shock of losing everything. So there is a political apathy. There is still distrust towards the former authorities, like general term, former authorities or former people. So all this, I think, contribute to the situation when Prime Minister has chances not only to be Prime Minister until 2026, but also secure another term.
There are still 2 years until 2026, and the situation may change, particularly if the government takes additional steps that are perceived as concessions to Azerbaijan. For instance, Baku's demand for a change of the Armenian constitution could be interpreted in this context. The constitution contains a preamble that references the Declaration of Independence from 1990, which calls for unification with Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan claims that the current constitution presents a territorial threat.
It depends how Prime Minister will be able to rep it. Because, of course, if he tells that, yes, President Aliyev called me and demanded me to change the constitution and I'm realizing his demands, probably there will be uproar here. But if you will bring many changes and will package it like, yes, it's one change is what Azerbaijan wants, which is probably bad, but also there are 15 good changes, then maybe people will say, okay, maybe we should vote for constitution. So I think it also depends on packaging. And that is why I believe now Prime Minister is telling that constitutional changes should follow the parliamentary elections and not vice versa.
At the end of August, the government announced that a referendum on a new constitution would take place in 2027. Political analysts are therefore concerned that Baku's demand could freeze the negotiations, even though the parties have already reportedly reached an agreement on approximately 80% of the peace deal.
We are in the most recent round of exchange of the text of the peace treaty. There have been several rounds, about a dozen of these exchanges of the text back and forth. And Armenia's aim continues to be to reach the finalization of the text quickly.
The currently discussed text resembles a framework agreement, with some sticking points removed. For example, at the beginning of August, Baku agreed to withdraw its demand for the so-called Zangezur corridor, a transport corridor that would connect Azerbaijan to its exclave Nakhchivan through Armenian territory. This issue should be addressed at a later time.
The peace treaty itself is already very framework-like. It basically repeats very well-known clauses of international law.
An important component of the agreement is the issue of demarcating the entire border. At the end of August, the Armenian and Azerbaijani state commissions for border delimitation signed a regulation on joint activities which will allow the delimitation process to continue. However, the process is expected to be long and challenging. The border remains a source of tensions, with sporadic exchanges of fire still reported along it. Moreover, Azerbaijan maintains troops on the sovereign territory of Armenia. In light of these ongoing tensions, the European Union has been monitoring the situation in the area since February 2023.
Since we arrived here, the number of incidents decreased significantly. We always had from time to time incidents, also with dead soldiers. What we never had since we are here, that civilians were harmed. But as I said, there were always incidents. Now it's quite calm since several weeks. It started in April when the first bilateral negotiation started about the demarcation and delimitation of the border in the north. Since then it's quite calm. But what we see is still both sides are fortifying and their positions, a lot of trenches, bunkers. So it seems that both sides don't trust this. They want to be prepared, but it hasn't been so calm for a long time.
It remains highly uncertain whether the two parties will be able to reach a sustainable peace agreement. However, the currently discussed draft would most likely face resistance even if Baku were to withdraw its demand for a constitutional change. The question is whether this resistance would be strong enough to threaten the government's position. Such a scenario could unfold if the government takes another step that would be perceived as a concession, or if the opposition successfully distances itself from past administrations, while presenting an agenda acceptable to both Armenians and the Nagorno-Karabakh community. One thing is certain: Armenian politics will continue to be heavily influenced by the conflict with Azerbaijan until a long-lasting peace is achieved.